Welcome to Come Home America with Nick Hankoff. I am so excited to bring you my first guest, and this is an old friend and a very treasured name in not just a libertarian movement, but the whole anti-war alternative media, really the best name you can turn to for foreign policy and for other matters as well. But I think really the state of the world in terms of the wars and American imperialism and the empire we know today is Scott Horton. And I'm so excited to have him on. So welcome to the show, Scott.
Hey, Nick, how are you, man?
Now, I want to give a proper introduction to you. I'm doing great. It's good to have you on here. I sort of skipped over your introduction because I'm really excited to have you on. But Scott is the director of the Libertarian Institute, the editorial director of antiwar.com. We're going to talk about one of his articles up at antiwar.com, but his headlines and little blog posts on Libertarian Institute are some of my favorite things online right now. But he's also host of Anti-War Radio. He's done over 5,000 interviews in the last 17 years or so, and I'm sure that number's way higher now, so Scott might update me on that. But you can hear him on 90.7 FM KPFK in Los Angeles, and of course that streams online as well, so anyone in the world can listen to him on that Pacifica radio station, kpfk.org. But you can download his interviews, listen to them on scotthorton.org. And let's see, he's the author. We're going to talk about his book, Fool's Errand, and it's about the Afghanistan war. We're also going to talk about a book he edited called The Great Ron Paul, The Scott Horton Show Interviews, 2004 to 2019. Scott lives in Austin, Texas with his wife, investigative reporter Larissa Alexandrovna Horton. And hello, Larissa, and hello, Scott. So it's really good to have you on. My first guest. You know, I feel like I'm so excited to start podcasting it going, but I'm also a little frazzled still, even though I know you. I'm not new to the camera per se, but it's just a little bit of a frazzling thing to get started, have the home studio brand new, have this whole setup brand new. So I really appreciate you helping me get this podcast started, Scott. There's no one better that I could think of to talk about the most important issues here. So I want to start, though, Scott, with your article, America, We Have to End the Wars Now. The coronavirus crisis makes it clear. And this you posted at antiwar.com. So you went around the world in this article, Scott. What inspired you to write this at this time?
Well, you know, the wars are, as Luke Skywalker said, such a long way from here. And I think that, I'm certain that they don't get the attention that they deserve. We're at war still in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, and more than that into sub-Saharan Africa and in East and West Africa. We have a massive buildup in Eastern Europe and in, surrounding China. And so the old, Bush government doctrine, the national security strategy of, permanent American military dominance over the whole planet is still on. And if there's been any real shift in the Trump years, it's been a shift, at least in attention, if not in troops, away from the Middle East and toward Russia and China. And as they call it in their national security strategy of 2017 or 2018, a return to great power conflict, when in fact we could call off our great power conflict with Russia and China just as well as the terror war against Islamic South Asia, because there are no real threats to peace to the United States coming from these countries. America is the world empire. America is the one that's starting all the conflicts and continuing all the conflicts. And so it occurs to me that, in the time of the COVID crisis epidemic, that probably everybody is thinking the same thing, which is that even though the wars are kind of going on outside of our view and maybe just sort of in the back of our mind, we all still know that this is going on. We're all aware that we spent, depends on how they estimate it, somewhere between and $7 trillion on the wars in the last 20 years. And that's just the cost of the wars. That doesn't include the full cost of the actual military establishment itself, which is another $1 trillion a year that we spend on all the submarines and carrier strike groups and our long-range bombers and nuclear weapons and the VA costs for all of our wounded soldiers and all of these things. And so we're just talking about an almost unfathomable amount of money that has been completely wasted on killing people in the 21st century. And the American population, our country, has absolutely nothing to show for it whatsoever. I'm not saying it would be justified if we'd gone to Iraq and stolen all the gold and oil or anything like that, but I'm just saying we didn't even get that. We got nothing out of it whatsoever. And so when I wrote that article, I was trying to appeal to the fact that everybody must agree with me, right? Everybody must be thinking the same thing as me, which is we really wish we hadn't done that. And maybe now is the time to go ahead and just call it off and admit that, you know what? If we had not spent that money, and I'm not saying the government, I'm saying the society, if we had not spent all that money on war, how much better off would our healthcare system be right now? For one example, how much more resilient would our economy be under the strain that it's being put under this lockdown? How much better off would the American people be? And that is the U.S. government's mandate in the Constitution. It's not to protect, so-called, protect the whole world. It's to protect the life and liberty of the American people. And instead, we have been sacrificed for the interests of, a special connected few at the expense of all the rest of us. And so I wrote that article hoping that it would kind of really appeal to people that, yeah, you know what? We really do think that we could have spent that $17 trillion or so, in a more effective way. It's almost inescapable. And in fact, I'm kind of disappointed because, essentially this crisis, instead of making people think in any kind of broader sense, they've just become even more narrow in their thinking than before, more selfish in their thinking than before. Now the rest of the world doesn't matter at all. Even when it's our own government killing them, people care only about themselves more than ever, and apparently don't even miss all the money that's been taken from us, that's been inflated away, and the rest, and deprived, that our government has deprived our society of this whole time. So, I guess it's the same as always, Nick, since I've known you. The American people already agreed with me, and they already agreed with you about these wars, that they're wasteful and expensive and not worthwhile, and they don't really protect us from terrorism or the Russians or the Chinese or anybody else. But they don't really care. And, as I wrote in the book about Afghanistan, it's the most opposed and least opposed war in American history.
That's right.
Yet, 70-something% of the American people don't think that we should be fighting it. But when you ask them, what issues do you worry about, or what do you think are the most important issues confronting America? Not Afghanistan, not any of the wars even make the list at all. They don't even make the list at all because people, it's just too far out of sight and out of mind.
With what you were saying about, we have gained nothing from these wars. At the same time, the American people haven't felt the pain, the cost of the wars, right? And so you ask, you have this call, and it matches right up with what I'm doing here, Come Home America, that call to, it's like, please, all right, come home America, please, or America, we have to end the wars now, please. Maybe if we said please, then maybe something would happen, right? But we've been saying the same thing for so many years now. But it's as if people don't feel the pain or the cost. There's no war tax, etc. And so it is a low priority for people to end these wars, even though they oppose them because they know they're not really getting a benefit out of them either. And so it is this abstraction that some other smart person's going to take care of for us. Maybe that's the mindset. But
well, and they're still hiding behind the infantry, right? Oh, how dare you disrespect the infantry? Haven't you ever heard the myth of the hippies spitting on the soldiers coming home from Vietnam?
Do you get mail like that still, or is that sort of died down?
You know
since
what?
Iraq
I mean,
war?
honestly, I think people are afraid of being accused of that kind of thing. But the comeback is pretty simple. I mean, look at the poll results from the other day. In fact, I think I have them here. The poll results from the other day from Military Times has that 70% of troops' family members, nearly 3/4 of veterans, so almost 75% of veterans, and almost 70% of troops' family members support a full withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. So they actually, if you compare those numbers to the most recent poll of regular American civilians, there are more veterans of the Iraq and Afghan wars that want those wars ended than the civilian population.
Right.
So the hawks always hide behind the infantry and say, oh, you can't criticize the war or else you're criticizing the soldiers for being brave enough to go and fight it. And yet, actually, the veterans are more anti-war than the American people at this point, because they're the ones who actually had to lose their best friend in the thing. They're the ones who actually went over there and fought and are now looking at, geez, everything me and my buddies did in the Battle of Ramadi, and it ended up back in the hands of the Islamic State for, 2 years, 2.5 years, and is never going to be what George W. Bush promised they were going to fight to make it in the first place. Some modern westernized democracy that confronts terrorism for us and all the things, all those lies from back then. There's nothing left for them to believe in. So the American people, I think, when they answer the poll, they're answering partially out of fear of being accused of not supporting the troops, when in fact, if they really support the troops, it's just like us anti-war folks said all along. If you support the troops, you got to oppose the policy. How is it supporting the troops to let a bunch of politicians lie right to their faces and to their mothers and fathers' faces and send them off to a desert to die for nothing?
Right. And so, the people are never allowed a direct vote on these things. We might assume that they would not vote for the Iraq war or to continue in Afghanistan or what have you, if it was just a plain yes or no vote. We see candidates like George W. Bush in 2000 get elected on a humble foreign policy platform, or Barack Obama get elected for hope and change. His vote against the Iraq war in the Senate boosted him past Hillary Clinton. And then in 2016, of course, Hillary Clinton's pro-war policies up against Donald Trump relatively seemed more hawkish at the time, and maybe they would have ended up more hawkish after all. And so the voters, there's a pattern now that's hard to ignore, that the voters are going for the less, the less sort of like what's the just this aggressive foreign policy, I'll just say, and at the same time, that they're not willing to put in too much effort, right? They're busy, and that's fine. That's why we need folks like you, Scott, to lay out the truth so that we are at least armed with that. But these wars, as you say, maybe you've estimated up to $16 trillion so far. I mean, you're counting all of the war spending and over the many years. That seems about right. I mean, but what I see is if the wars are ended and we're actually able to spend this money, say over the next 20 years, the way we've learned to spend money from spending it in these wars is that now we have this Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez type, and I know there's a caricature and that can be tiresome, but there is that rising voice that says, we can spend this money. If we can spend it on war, then we can spend it on UBI, make work projects, healthcare, free college, all that, et cetera stuff. And obviously, the Trump administration is pushing for this infrastructure, $2 trillion infrastructure project. These $1,200 check payments look like, it's possible political pressure may build up, especially in a presidential year, to send out more cash to people. So I think that is it too late really to learn some of these lessons? Have we learned the wrong lessons? And then I have another question for you after that, but I'll just let you answer that, what you think of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is where Marxism comes from in the first place, right? It was one of these Franco-Prussian wars or something or other where Marx said, oh, so it turns out that the government can organize the feeding of however many million men at a time and all of these things. But they can only do that when they're lining you up to go and kill and die in one of these big fake wars. But meanwhile, the rest of the time, hey, you got to fend for yourself, go hungry if that's the way it is, and et cetera, like this. And so then the idea was that government ought to organize instead of for war, it ought to organize to take care of everybody, in this kind of a way. And without really recognizing that all the food that the government's feeding the army is all food that was harvested last year. And who's going to harvest it this year when you got all the farm boys in your infantry? It's not so simple. But the idea is, just as you just said, hey, they can organize to take all this money in order to kill a bunch of Iraqis who never even threatened us, in order to turn the Middle East upside down for 20 years for no good reason at all. It only makes sense to a leftist that the government should be spending all of that money on taking care of people instead. And of course, this is a huge problem because the government are all lying murderers. They're the last people in the world that you would want to take care of you. And they can only take care of you by confiscating wealth from other people. They don't have any wealth of their own. If you really ask them to follow the, Communist Manifesto and nationalize all of the farmland and conscript an agricultural army to, reap and sow it, then sow and reap it, then we'll all starve. And we've seen this over and over in communist countries, that the people just starve to death because the government doesn't know how to run the farms better than the kulaks do. Of course they don't. And certainly not over the long term. And so, but you're right that, people are making the argument that, well, you have enough money to kill 2 million Iraqis and Syrians and Afghans and Yemenis and Libyans and Somalis. You got $6 trillion to bail out the bankers at the drop of a hat. So why shouldn't you pay everybody's rent and pay everybody's mortgage and pay everybody's healthcare costs, right? And everybody's education? It would be cheaper to do that. Yeah. And so, frankly, any good libertarian should prefer that to war. As Anthony Gregory said, war is even worse than Social Security.
Even worse, yeah.
The very worst argument against Social Security by my lights is that Bismarck, the right-wing conservative, war leader, that he supported the creation of Social Security in Germany precisely to create new support for the central state, to divide people from their families and to make people dependent on the central government. And so, to me, the entire welfare state, especially look at America, the entire welfare state is just our bribe so that we don't hang all of these people from lampposts and burn these institutions to the ground, because how dare they? For all the wars they start, for all the bailouts of billionaires, for all the innocent people rotting in prison cells or dying of COVID-19 in prison cells where they don't belong in the first place. But geez, who's going to pay for my college? Who's going to pay for my light bill? Who's going to make sure that I have enough groceries? Who's going to take care? And so,
right. I would love to get
bribe. It's most explicit with like the GI Bill, right? But it also comes in all over the place. And in fact, people who are like radical leftist revolutionaries find out that actually they're conservatives and they don't want to see the old order overthrown at all because the old order is coming through for them. And
absolutely. I'd love to get
into
that that whole topic with you about how the centralized state, I mean, it is appropriate to go back to Bismarck. And I think just in the past 100 years, how the centralization of the state has really eroded these other institutions like our families, our communities, all these other decentralized mutual aid sort of support systems are, have been crippled and lost in many ways, and otherwise they're sort of hijacked and used as platforms for people instead of helping to form communities or bring people up. But that would be an awesome another episode if I could bring you on again. But I do want to move on to maybe one last question on this article that you wrote, which everyone needs to read. Just America, We Have to End the Wars Now, and on antiwar.com by Scott Horton. You go through Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya, Mali, Tunisia, Nigeria, Chad, and more. And I think Yemen, maybe you offered the most detail there. And Yemen boils down to a genocide and treason. And, we don't need to get into all the details of the Yemen war right now, but when things are this disassociated from 9/11, and yet done in the name of 9/11, and yet also done to defend Al-Qaeda in Yemen. I mean, the U.S. being on the same side as Al-Qaeda, fighting for Al-Qaeda's interests, not against. When it's this far removed, this abstract, this like nihilistic, however you want to put it at this point, will it take like a collapse of the dollar, or a collapse of the system, a way to force these wars to end? And will it only be at that point when we lose this mystique of the state that we glom onto, as you were talking about, for our hopes and dreams, and who will support us when we're down, and who will help us get into college and feed us and all this stuff? Will this mystique of the state only fall when the dollar collapses, or the military establishment can't go on being funded that way anymore? I mean, how else does it end? Because we're not allowed to vote to end the wars in one fell swoop in some national election that way. It's always a choice not left up to the people. So that's my question to you. Do you see this ending in a systemic collapse? And I mean, I'm not going to ask you to make any predictions, but do you feel like we're near that? What do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, yes, I think that's right. As Ron Paul always said, this is going to fall apart, not because you listen to me, but just because we cannot afford it anymore. And so that's what I was trying to do with this article, is say, okay, here we are. We cannot afford it anymore. How could anyone think? Because see, it's not just that, oh, geez, we wish we had more beds and more PPE for, this, viral outbreak, but that in response, our government has locked down the entire economy. It forced us into a Great Depression. And we don't know exactly how bad it's going to be, but we do know, libertarians know, we were already in a giant inflated bubble anyway. The only question was whether it's going to pop before or after the next election. And then it turns out that the virus was the deflationary pressure needed to pop that bubble. So we already know we were headed for a great recession anyway, with the collapse of QE 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, et cetera, that they've done since the last crash. And so, the way it should be is that right now, this is it. That the American people, that was why I wrote this article, is to get to kind of galvanize that opinion that, if sooner or later is someday coming, it might as well be now. We might as well face the reality that this thing has not worked out the way that they said. It's cost all this money. Now we're going to be in a Great Depression. Certainly, if you look at all the charts in the David Stockman columns, it makes 2008 and 9 look like nothing in the scheme of things. And so, what better time to call it off than now? I mean, do we really have to have the dollar just break and have, widespread price inflation because they have to print so much money to pay off the debt? Or maybe we could just recognize that right now, this is where the most wealth is being wasted. And again, to no good end. And again, as you put it, I won't go into all the detail and all that for time, but they said it was a war against terrorism, a war primarily against Al-Qaeda, against the bin Ladenites who would dare to slaughter American civilians. And yet in Libya, in Syria, and especially in Syria, but also especially in Yemen, they have got us fighting on the side of the bin Ladenites against the American government's true enemies, Iran. Not that Iran is really, and the Shia are really enemies of the American people, but they are our government's strategic adversaries for dominance in the region. And so our government is willing to side with the Al-Qaeda types who have attacked the United States.
Without hesitation.
Without hesitation, in order to spite their Houthi allies. And now, if you go back to 5 years ago, when the war against Yemen began, this is not the CIA war against AQAP. This is when they turned around and stabbed them in the back, stabbed the Houthis in the back and took AQAP's side against them. Well, you had generals complaining about this to the great Mark Perry. It was in Al Jazeera America, but the great Pentagon reporter Mark Perry was quoting American generals saying that they were absolutely against this. We know now that, looking back on it, that Michael Vickers, who was the Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, Deputy Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, had told the Atlantic Council, and it was also reported by the Wall Street Journal in January of 2015, that CENTCOM, Central Command, was working with the Houthis and passing them intelligence that they were using to hunt down and kill Al-Qaeda guys. And only 2 months later, Obama turned around, stabbed the Houthis in the back, and took Al-Qaeda's side against them. And this whole war that has made zero progress in terms of ousting the Houthis from the capital city of Sana'a, which was supposedly the plan in the first place, for 5 years straight, has benefited AQAP. Now, these are the guys who bombed the USS Cole. They tried to bomb the USS Sullivans, but their dinghy sank, but they were going to, bomb another ship. They helped to coordinate the September 11th attack, as you can read in James Bamford's book, The Shadow Factory. Mm-hmm. They did the Christmas 2009 underpants bombing over Detroit, where they tried to blow up a plane over Detroit, which luckily failed. And then the failed printer cartridge bombing attack. And then they were involved in coordinating and planning the Charlie Hebdo attack in France in 2015. And so these are real ass bin Ladenites. These are the enemies of the American people. And our government is fighting on their side against their enemies, the Houthis. And why? Because the Houthis are friends with Iran that did not attack us.
Yeah. Well, and that's a very sad state of affairs there in Yemen. I mean, you haven't even gotten into really the death toll on children under 5 years old.
Yeah, let me just say real quick. They've deliberately targeted the Americans and the Saudis, their partners, and the UAE have deliberately targeted the waterworks, the sewage, the electricity, the hospitals, and the farms, Nick. They bomb the flocks of sheep in the field. They bomb the grain silos. They bomb the irrigation systems for the farms. They are deliberately waging war against the civilian population. It's a medieval-style siege against the civilian population of Yemen in order to somehow pressure them into overthrowing their government for us. These are war crimes. This is absolutely illegal under international law and under American law. That international law was written by America. These are our standards, and our government is absolutely in violation of them. And Barack Obama and Donald Trump should be sharing a prison cell, a supermax in Florence, Colorado, for breaking the law in targeting and murdering civilians in direct violation of the Geneva Conventions, and in a war that is not just unauthorized in any way whatsoever by Congress, but a war that, in fact, Congress has invoked the War Powers Resolution twice to try to stop. And Trump has just vetoed it and continued on. And so, in any other circumstance, if this was Russia doing this to Yemen, our government would be invoking these war crimes as an excuse to fight them.
Yeah, that's right. And I do want to move on to sort of the old renewed Cold War theater that you write about in this essay, and also North Korea. But just to pause for a moment, and as we're getting down into the nitty gritty on just one theater in Yemen, the costs of these wars, if people aren't feeling them now, can they maybe this coronavirus episode, can it wake people up to realize that the future for their children or their grandchildren is not as promising as they were raised up to believe it would be? And is that a point where people might care a little bit more? You know, we were talking about in the beginning it being a low priority to change the situation that they do not support because they weren't feeling the pain of it. But do you see anything out of this coronavirus episode that people will start to be more aware that their children and grandchildren will grow up in a much worse place because they didn't do anything? What about that? Because you write in here in this essay that we should be passing a legacy of liberty onto our children. At the very least, can we pass on a legacy of less war, right? So what do you think about that? You're talking about children in just one line in this article, but it was very powerful to me. So,
yeah, well, I mean, that's a great question, Nick. It depends whether people can essentially break free of their government school conditioning that, gee, our democracy wouldn't be doing these things if it was unnecessary. So our government deserves the benefit of the doubt. After all, if they're killing people, they must have a good reason to do so. Don't ask me to learn a bunch of Arabic names and figure out who's who over there, but it's them Muslims what attacked us. And so guess that's who we have to fight. If people aren't willing to get past that, they're not willing to accept that actually George Bush and Barack Obama and Donald Trump are devils. They don't represent us at all. They're the scum of the earth. They're lower than any junkie bum that you'd see begging on the side of the road. In fact, those are oftentimes very decent people. And that they deserve no deference whatsoever. That even when they're trying their best, they're wrong about everything. They ruin everything they touch in a reverse Midas touch. If they're not willing to, deal with the reality of that, and just because someone is elected to power in America doesn't mean that what they do is right. And same for this guy as it is for the last guy and the guy before him and the guy before him. If they're not willing to deal with that beyond this kind of sixth grade, salute the flag kind of a conception, then, I don't know. I mean, again, there's such an incentive, such a disincentive, I guess, to be honest about this stuff. If you're worried, I mean, this is just a couple of years ago, right? And they didn't even deal with this at all for years and years and years. It was just a year or two ago that they did the episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm where Larry David gets in trouble for not thanking the guy for his service. Everybody, oh, thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. And Larry David's like, I don't know why I just have to say everything everybody else said. And he wasn't even insulting the guy for his service. He just didn't want to say the same thing as everybody else. And they act like, oh, how dare you not fall in line for this? How dare you not click your heels? When, this is recorded, I mean, they produced that episode in like 2018 after America already lost the war in Afghanistan, already lost the war in Iraq twice by then. They'd lost the war in Iraq after it was clear to everyone who ever believed that there's nothing to believe in anymore. And yet, oh, no, you still can't criticize it because the very toughest guys in our society might cry if you do. You'll hurt their tiny little pathetic feelings. And so you can't say anything negative about the absolutely inane and insane policy that they've helped to implement. And because, frankly, people are cowards, right? Larry David is a coward. Larry David's character didn't say, let's get real. All you did was put Iran's friends in power in Baghdad. Why should I thank you for that? All you did was help build up Zarqawi's group that wasn't even loyal to bin Laden, and you made them loyal to bin Laden, and you grew them from 40 guys into 40,000 guys. And why should I thank you for that? Instead, you're
gonna make me smile throughout the rest of this episode.
Refuse to state the truth.
I'll just be thinking of Curb Your Enthusiasm for the rest of this episode. So while I'm smiling about all the wars, right, I'm actually thinking of Larry David, okay? But
exactly, that guy's funny.
But yeah, it's hilarious. But I think right around that time, I don't know if that was the year that Dan Crenshaw was elected to Congress. I know he's a new guy in Congress, and he's really revivified this "thank you for your service" kind of.
The new John McCain.
Right. And so maybe you should have Dan Crenshaw on your show, Scott. But no, let's talk about we might be halfway through this interview if I can get through some other things here. Germany troops are still in Germany after World War II, after the Cold War ended. Why are we still in Germany? And it's really about this ongoing Cold War, just in case we ever want to heat it up again, or more than we already are, if that's possible, with Russia. Now, are we at the warmest temperature possible for this still to be a Cold War with Russia? And of course, Ukraine, Trump being impeached over not sending them more weapons sooner for less in exchange, kind of thing. Can you talk about these two episodes or these two examples of us staying in Germany? What are we doing in Germany right now? And also the position of the United States in Ukraine in relation to Russia. What is the state of the Cold War in all of this? And if we got our troops out, what do you think the natural relationship between the U.S. and Russia might otherwise be?
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, basically the deal is the Cold War never ended. Just because the Soviet Union lost it and then ceased to exist, the Americans, they worked very hard to control Boris Yeltsin and his government and to use their influence to make sure that he got reelected in 1996. And, I don't know, he was really necessarily an American puppet under American control, but he certainly was no match for the Americans and had no ability really to stand up to them. But then he's the guy who appointed Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin took over at New Year's 2000 and has essentially been the president ever since then. And he's a patriot and a nationalist. And so the Americans have been trying to figure out a way to marginalize him and remove him and to, put the Russian Federation back in a state of submission, essentially, to the West ever since then. And they can't quite figure out how to do it. I'll note to you that Chalmers Johnson, the author of Blowback, Sorrows of Empire, and Nemesis, The Last Days of the American Republic, that he, like Pat Buchanan and Jude Wanniski and Scott McConnell and many others who had turned kind of paleo-conservative after the end of the Cold War, and he ended up becoming more of a Democrat, Chalmers Johnson did, I guess. But at the time, these were all hardcore anti-communist Cold Warrior Reaganite supporters. And then when the Soviet Union ceased to exist, they said, okay, great, emergency's over, time to come home. And when the John Birchers said, no, it's all a trick, they're trying to trick us into disarming, Pat Buchanan laughed and said, listen, they pulled their entire army back behind the Ural Mountains and, fired half of them. I mean, it is over. It is over. Eastern Europe is free, and we do not have to be a world empire anymore. And Chalmers Johnson especially said, well, geez, once I saw that the American empire did not come home, that's what really made me question. And then he went back and he became a revisionist of the whole Cold War and said that, yes, there was some of this was about, defending our friends and non-communist countries from Soviet expansion. But really, it was an excuse. The Americans had their own world empire to build. And what better foil than the Soviet Union, the red communist, atheist, godless Soviet Union, and brutal empire. And so they had used that as an excuse. And once the Soviet Union was gone, the American empire stayed. And not only did it stay, but it continued to expand. And so that made Johnson and others actually go back and rethink their entire support for the Cold War when the Soviet Union did exist. Much less supporting it after it no longer existed. And it's been clear since, George H.W. Bush, who presided over the end of the Cold War, he launched Iraq War I when the Soviet Union was still standing. It still had another year to go before it dissolved, Christmas Day of 1991. And then Bill Clinton, instead of bringing all our troops home and cashing the peace dividend and all of that, instead he just printed a bunch of money and continued to expand the American empire around the world and made it seem free by having Alan Greenspan just print it and buy up bad debt, expand the money supply, and allow the banks to expand the money supply and to make the world empire seem free. So instead of demanding their peace dividend, the American people said, oh, I guess we can have a world empire on the cheap.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that led to the giant crash of 99 and 2000, which people didn't understand that was the cost of expanding the American empire. And so under Bill Clinton, they brought, I think, 8 new countries into NATO, and including, and then it was under George W. Bush that they included the Baltic states or maybe that was still actually during Clinton. I think it was during W. Bush that they brought in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia right there on Russia's border. And then Bush brought in, I don't know, 5 or 8 more countries. Obama, I lost count of who brought in, but Obama approved the entry of a few more. And this is, to the people who run it, Nick, it's like a social club where, a bunch of, prominent politicians get together at night and have drinks and talk about how great and peaceful they are. But in reality, this is a military alliance, and they spread it right up to Russia's border and are attempting to completely surround them and dominate them. And all this has done, of course, is engender a terrible reaction on the part of the Russians, which the Americans then exploit and say whatever the Russians do as a defensive matter against the Americans and our military alliance then becomes termed as aggression and the reason for it. A perfect example of this is when Putin moved troops between military bases inside Russia. And Hillary Clinton complained that he's moving his troops around right on NATO's doorstep.
Yeah.
When we're talking about moving troops between bases inside Russia. And yet that is aggression somehow against us. Now, the deal with Ukraine is, the most obvious parallel is with Canada. Imagine if America had lost the Cold War and the Soviet Union had expanded the Warsaw Pact to include all of our Western European former allies, France and Britain and Spain and the Netherlands and Denmark and all of those. And then not only that, they started expanding their military alliance in the Caribbean and in Latin America and into Mexico. Mm. And then with Canada, when the people of Canada resisted and decided to elect pro-American governments, what if the Russians had done 2 coups in 10 years to overthrow those pro-American governments and install their own guys in charge? And what if in 2014 they'd use literal Hitler-loving Nazis to overthrow the government of Canada and then to take over the military and go to war against the people of Vancouver and British Columbia who refused to accept the new coup d'etat junta under the control of pro-Russian puppets? You know the answer to that question. The USA would go to nuclear war.
Yeah, it seems hard to imagine that could ever happen, right?
It's absolutely unthinkable that America would allow the Russians to overthrow the Canadian government for even a day without going to war over the idea. And we have our Monroe Doctrine, which says that if the European countries stay out of the Western Hemisphere, well, first of all, it says they better. And then second of all, it says, and we'll stay out of Europe. Mm-hmm. Everybody always forgets that part. And then, but the idea that the Russians would have a Monroe Doctrine, where they say, actually, for the people of the middle part of North America to come and consolidate and bring Ukraine, their Canada, into our military alliance is a bridge too far. Unacceptable. That is unacceptable. How dare they? Of course, Ukraine belongs to us and not to them. And if you look at the arrogance with which the American policymakers have acted in, first of all, the Orange Revolution when they overthrew the government in 2004, but then especially in the Obama years, 10 years later, when they used literal Hitler-loving Nazis to overthrow the Russia-leaning government in Kiev and install this lawless, murderous junta that immediately went to war against the people of the Donbass region in the east of the country, killed almost 10,000 of them, and their own countrymen, all just to suck up to the United States and to obey the dictates of the United States. This could have started a war with Russia. And in fact, I mean, we really have Putin's, patience essentially to thank. He decided that, well, what he would do is he would take the Crimean Peninsula. This is one of the main reasons America wanted to overthrow the government in Ukraine. That's because they wanted to kick the Russians out of the Sevastopol naval base and take it over for themselves. And Putin just joked about this and said, you know, we really like our NATO partners. He refuses to call us adversaries or anything. We love our NATO partners. And we thought about how nice it might be to go down to Sevastopol to visit them for the holidays. And we decided that actually it would be better for us to go ahead and keep the base and they can come and visit us.
Oh, boy.
In other words, you cannot have our warm water port. You just can't. And they seized the Crimean Peninsula in order to prevent that from happening. And then, but it turns out the population of Crimea always wanted to be Russians anyway.
Absolutely.
And there's hardly any Ukrainians. It's like less than a fifth of the population are Ukrainians. The super majority of the population are ethnic Russians and Russian speakers. And it was only a technicality that Crimea ever belonged to Ukraine at all. It was a Russian province since the 1780s, before James Madison and George Washington wrote the U.S. Constitution. When we were still under the Articles of Confederation was when the Russians had taken it, and, you know, with payment from the Ottoman Empire. And they, or the Turks, whoever they were then. And they've ruled it ever since then. But the people of Eastern Ukraine, when they voted in a plebiscite and asked to rejoin or to join the Russian Federation, Putin told them no. He said, you know, essentially he sent special operations guys to help them fend off the government in Kiev. But he refused to accept Eastern Ukraine as part of Russia. He could have absorbed it in a day. Nobody could have done anything to stop him. And he refused to do so because that was never his plan. And in fact, you know, the Russians had a deal going back to the end of the Soviet Union that they would continue to lease the Sevastopol naval base and leave it under the control of the Ukrainians. It was only when the Americans and the Ukrainian Nazi junta pushed their luck that and destroyed the status quo that he was, that he determined to take it in the first place. But this is the kind of thing that where, you know, the people who run our government are so self-assured that they think that they can get away with stuff like this, and they just can't. Now, I'll refer you to the WikiLeaks, where the foreign minister, the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, told, I think it was, I forget which American ambassador it was at the time, but he told him, and the guy reported back in his State Department email, you can find it, it's titled, "Niet means niet." And this is where Sergei Lavrov said, listen, if you guys bring Ukraine into NATO, we will invade it. Mm-hmm. And that is a fact. And you go back and you tell your bosses, you may not integrate Ukraine into NATO because we say no. And you know, and I know that we can be in Kiev in 2 weeks. Niet means niet. And what do the Americans think? That they can just do it anyway? And I think that was before the coup. That would have been, yeah, because that was from the WikiLeaks. So that was, you know, from the Bush years or very early Obama years when they had said that. And then to check out the thinking, people need to look at this before it's gone off the internet forever, is you have to find, two things. There's, first of all, Victoria Nuland's intercepted phone call that the Russians leaked on YouTube with Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt planning the coup of February of 2014. But then there's also a really instructive interview with Gideon Rose, who is the editor of Foreign Affairs, the journal of the Council on Foreign Relations. And he's being interviewed on the Stephen Colbert Show, the old Colbert Show on the Comedy Channel. And he describes the whole thing, that what we're doing here is in fact, the reason he was on the Colbert Show was to celebrate and mock the Russians and spike the football. And he says, that's right. You see, Ukraine is like Russia's girlfriend, or Ukraine is like Robin to Russia's Batman. And so our job here is to separate Ukraine away from Russia, to take away their extremely important strategic asset in a way that they can't do anything about it. And we got Putin is so distracted by the Sochi Olympics that he can't stop us. And Gideon Rose and Victoria Nuland both talk about the coup in the same way. It's all about, we've got to get it nailed down and finished before Putin can figure out how to react. And then we'll have gotten away with it. But of course, that's not what happened at all. Putin ended up seizing the Crimean Peninsula and ended up when the people of the East decided to declare independence from the completely illegal coup d'etat regime and that coup d'etat regime declared war against them. Putin spent, I don't know, not too much money. Probably all it took was a few $1 million in support for the people of the East to maintain their independence in that war and protect themselves from being conquered by the new regime. And so it didn't work at all. And if you go back and listen now to Victoria Nuland's intercepted phone call, or listen to Gideon Rose on the Colbert Show, or watch Gideon Rose on the Colbert Show, you can see where they're blinded by their arrogance. They think that we're the USA, like George Bush marching into Iraq. We're the USA. We can do whatever we want, and nobody can ever stop us. This is what, in fact, sorry for another tangent, but Gareth Porter, the greatest reporter in the world, wrote a book about Vietnam, and it's called The Perils of Dominance. And this is his whole theory about how we got into Vietnam, was America was too powerful compared to China and the Soviet Union. And so they got it into their head that we can do whatever we want and no one can stop us. Who's going to tell us no? Ho Chi Minh? Yeah, right. We got H-bombs. We got the U.S. Army and Marine Corps. Nobody can stand up against us, when in fact that's just not true. And everybody else has their own red lines. And everybody else also would rather die than to give in to a foreign enemy, just the same as us. And so they convince themselves that they can do whatever they want and get away with whatever they want, when it's just not so. And so, to your question about just how warm is this Cold War now, we're at the most dangerous point in the history of American-Russian relations since at least the early 1980s and the first Ronald Reagan administration level of brinksmanship. And I've heard it said by people who have the experience that we've never been closer to real conflict with Russia as we are right now since the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is how bad relations are between our government and theirs, and it's 100% America's fault. In fact, that's my previous article for antiwar.com.
Right. The new Cold War with Russia is all America's fault.
And as simple as that. And by the way, I've had a couple of extremely prominent and well-informed Russia experts, real experts, tell me they agree with every word of that speech.
I have an idea. One of them is, I don't know. I mean, I'd just be guessing, but Stephen, what was his name? I forget his name. But
no, Stephen Cohen is who you're thinking of.
Yeah.
But no, I'm far too low of a scumbag for hoity-toity fancy pants like Stephen Cohen to even respond to. But I will say that one of them is Ray McGovern, who is the former director of the CIA's analyst Soviet division back during the bad old days of the Cold War. The other one was off the record, but believe me, is a real Russia expert. And I sent him that. He said, I agree with every word of this.
Yeah, and that's The New Cold War with Russia is All America's Fault. Another great read from you, Scott, at antiwar.com. I could talk to you all day, and if you can stay longer, I'll be glad. But I do have one question that I want to get to. If it is the last one, I think it'll be a good one to round up. But you have these these headlines like The New Cold War with Russia is All America's Fault. You have you set yourself up for the other person on the opposite side to say these colloquialisms like, "Oh, you're bashing America," or "You hate America," right? Like, so you like to put yourself out there for that opposition to strike. And I think this is my hunch, is that you set yourself up to be called an America hater or whatever, because really deep down, like, you love America more than they do. Is that accurate? I mean, how do you see, what I want to get at with this question is, if that's a correct characterization, then what is your hope for America? What about America speaks to you that you want to see either the country revive or somehow transition into or grow into? These are the questions that we struggle with because we know we can't turn back the clock, right? But at the same time, part of this country, part of the idea of the country we love. And so I just want to get that out of you. What about this country do you love? Do you want to see change for the better? And is that characterization that I set up in the first part of the question correct?
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, first of all, as far as, my titles being provocative or that kind of thing, I'm just trying to get people to pay attention. It's not a means to an end of having them call me out so I can get in a further argument about it.
Okay, yeah,
But
sure.
I mean, the reality is you can tell by listening to me that probably that I'm a Texan. And so that makes me a double extra patriot. I mean, I think New Yorkers and Virginians are kind of like this too, where they have this sort of extra double state patriotism that I don't know if people in Arizona are like that or not, but there's a extra amount of pride that comes from being a Texan. And, I've never been to Russia. I don't have any stake in Russia. I don't give a damn about the point of view of the people of Russia as far as that goes, other than how it affects me and how it affects, my relationship with the government of the United States. And, I am a patriot. That means I love my country. But I also agree with the definition of a patriot is someone, a true patriot is someone who loves their country at the expense of their government, who is willing to stand up against their government on behalf of their country. Because I do not accept in the slightest bit the common narrative and conception that our government means well, or even when they do, that they have the slightest idea of what they're doing. I mean, just take, for example, Bill Clinton and George Bush and Barack Obama and Donald Trump. And you can keep going back as far as you want. Reagan and Carter and Ford and Nixon, LBJ. These people are the scum of the earth. Okay, these people are terrible people, and they're dumber than a damn doorknob too. I mean, George W. Bush, who got us into this mess in this century, had no idea what he was messing with. He spent all of his, intellectual capital dressing up like a fake cowboy and posturing around when he was never a cowboy. They bought that pig farm that they called the Bush Ranch. They bought that in 1999 as he was running in the primaries for president. It was just a set. The whole thing was fake. He didn't wear cowboy boots. He's from Connecticut. But he, if you go back and watch the footage, have you ever seen Leading to War, where it's just raw footage of them lying us into war in the year 2002?
I haven't watched
All of his intellectual capital went into posturing and none into thinking about what he's doing, whether it's really the right thing to start a war in a country that he knows nothing about these people or what's going to happen. Based on what Paul Wolfowitz's word, that it had been all gamed out and don't worry, it's going to work well. I mean, this is completely nuts. Seems like anybody any smarter than him would have known better. And speaking as a guy who was a cab driver at the time and whose specialty was driving drunks home from the bar at night, I can tell you any idiot did know better. Plenty of people knew better than to do what he was doing and had no reason to trust that this was going to work anything like the way that they said. And so it's the same thing with Trump. It's the same thing with Barack Obama. If you love your country, you have to hate your government. They are the worst enemy of life and liberty in this society. They are the worst enemy of our natural civil and civil rights and liberties, and of even having a structure of the society where our politics are centered around the question of protecting freedom, protecting human liberty as our highest value. All that has been destroyed by these idiots. And any American, any grown adult who respected and went along with the policies and supported the policies of Bill Clinton and George Bush, Barack Obama and Donald Trump, you're living through the wreckage right now. I mean, people's absolute blindness to Bill Clinton's sins, that's what got us attacked on September 11th and wrote the blank check for George W. Bush to do all the damage that he did. And with all the precedents he set, that just allowed Barack Obama to double down. When all the consequences of George Bush's war came home to Libya and Syria, Obama took the consequences side and made things that much worse. And so I've hated him since I was a kid. I've hated all cops since I was 11 years old and first met one in the wild. I've hated all federal cops since, well, I always had reason to in the 80s for all the selling the drugs for Ronald Reagan and clamping down on anyone who would consume the drugs that they imported. But then especially after Waco and after they lied their asses off about the Oklahoma City bombing and blamed it all on this one guy instead of him and his 10 friends who helped him do it, because they were all undercover cops, of course, informants and flip states witnesses. And at the same time, Bill Clinton bombing Iraq endlessly for 8 years straight from bases in Saudi Arabia, even though the right-wing religious radicals of Saudi Arabia vowed that they were going to kill Americans until we knocked it off, and then did absolutely nothing to protect us from the enemy that he had created out of Carter and Reagan and Bush's old mercenaries that Clinton turned against us. And so, yes, all patriots should be absolute anti-government extremists. If you love your country, you hate your government. These people, all of them, are war criminals, and they're criminals against the American people and against the U.S. Constitution. So, but then what would I like to see? I would like to see every law passed since 1791 repealed. That would be a good start. I really am an anarchist. I think that, all good libertarians who accept the non-aggression obligation, that really does mandate anarcho-capitalist, private property anarchism type of a scheme, I think. And withdrawal of all consent for the state. But if people are minarchists and they think that, well, you need at least enough government to keep a worse one from replacing it, then still we don't need any of what we have now of this Leviathan. The whole thing should be completely, destroyed and scattered. Any of the powers that exist at the federal level should be, implemented by the states or not at all. And, we should have at least the choice to vote with our feet between the states about how different policies are meant to be, are implemented against the people. And so much of that is nullified by having a single centralized, powerful general government like we have in D.C. now. So, I don't know. That was kind of a long rambling thing. But the point is that you don't need the government to have the USA. You don't need, our current Leviathan in order to have a country, in order to have a civilization. And look at the way everybody hates each other now. Why does everybody hate each other so much on the right and the left, especially against each other? And the answer is because they're fighting over total power. Mm-hmm. Who is going to have their hand on the reins of total power over their fellow countrymen? And so, of course, it's a fight to the death. You can see this the same way on the state level with like control over the school board or the state education commission. Which textbook are we going to have? Is it going to be the one favored by the secular humanist liberals or the ones favored by the conservative Christian, conservatives? What'd I say? Yeah, the Republican Christian conservatives. And so they fight like hell over who's going to get to make the decision of how to inculcate everybody else's kids with their own point of view. It's the same thing to the nth degree on the national level. Who's going to have the power to use the IRS against their political opponents? Who's going to have the power to use the NSA and the FBI against them? Who's going to have the power to lord it over their enemies? And so that's why people fight like hell and resent the other side so badly when they lose their chance at power. And right now, I mean, I don't know how far it can go, but there's talk of another civil war. There's talk of people just absolutely refusing to take it anymore. This is not the other party gaining power temporarily in the democracy, and you win some, you lose some, better luck next time. This is a fight over, well, total power. Look at Virginia, for example, right now, where you're about to have South Virginia secede from the rest of Virginia over gun rights. You had West Virginia broken off over the Civil War back in the 1860s. And you're at the point now where all of the big cities in the north and in the suburbs outside of Washington, D.C. are taken over by liberals. The state legislature and the governorship are taken over by liberal Democrats who are determined to crush the gun rights of the rest of the population of the state. And, fortunately, they backed down on trying to ban the AR-15, but only because thousands of AR-15 gun owners went and essentially laid siege for a day to the Capitol in what was a peaceful protest, but surely a warning. And so Absolutely. They passed all of their different gun control proposals except that one. But if they had passed the AR-15 ban, I don't know if you would have seen a war, but you would have seen, I think you could have seen violence, because I think what would have happened is...
you don't see these things until years down the line either. So we don't even know really the full repercussions of some of the things that go on now.
That's true too. And the reality is that most of the cops and National Guard types, they're right wingers. So if it really came down to it, are they going to follow the orders of the governor? Are they going to follow the orders of the local sheriff? They're just going to quit the National Guard and go home to their home county? Or how exactly is that supposed to work? And which Democrat or Republican office holder is supposed to have the wisdom and the patience to figure out how to keep the compromises floating and keep these people in one state together when they already are at each other's throats and hate each other so much and respect each other's power at, to no degree whatsoever. And look, the solution to all this is liberty. It's not moving. And let me say this. What really happened, right, was this post-Cold War consensus. That's what ruined everything, was the Bush and Clinton family dynasty consensus. And they are very close, the two families. Bill Clinton was considered H.W. Bush's, son that he wished he'd ever had, as opposed to W, his big disappointment. But this centrist consensus, the liberal Republican Bushes and the conservative Democrat Clintons, and go ahead and throw in Biden and Obama as Clintons. They're no different as far as all that consensus goes. They've completely blown it. And they have, through essentially their financial crises more than anything else, but along with their wars and their immigration and trade policies and everything they've done to ruin the economy for the American people, they have completely destroyed the legitimacy of that kind of centrist liberalism. And so now you have the left side of American politics moving further and further to the left towards this, as they call it, democratic socialism. And the right wing, country club conservatism is dead and is replaced by this right wing nationalist populism. And they're moving further and further to the right. They consider each other to be Nazis and communists instead of anything like Republicans and Democrats and liberals and conservatives anymore. And it seems to me like the only solution would be, I don't know, for Ron Paul to somehow be 30 years younger and run as a libertarian right now and figure out how to get people to understand that we all hate each other too much to take turns sharing total power. That's not going to work. What's going to work, if anything is going to work, is going to be embracing liberty as our highest political value and allowing people to be free and allowing the national government to step back and let the states take over more and more of their functions so that there's less and less power to fight about at the national level.
We will have to come back on for another episode with you, Scott, because we went through so much in an hour, but not enough. There's so much more to cover. And I think really talking about the road ahead for America is a really interesting one. But the history, and the recent history in particular, is well worth studying. Scott's book, Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, is a much highly recommended book, not just by me, but by the likes of Ron Paul, Patrick Coburn, Daniel Ellsberg, some great blurbs on the back from James Bovard as well. So definitely check out Fool's Errand. And you can find that book at libertarianinstitute.org, obviously on Amazon as well. You can support Scott directly at scotthorton.org, both Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com, where Scott is editorial director. Both of those are 501c3 nonprofits, so very, very easy to go and support those. And I highly recommend Scott's anti-war radio show on KPFK. So go check that out. Scott, it's been an honor to have you. Thank you so much for coming on Come Home America. We have to do it again soon.
Thanks very much for having me, Nick. Anytime.
All right. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Come Home America. My name's Nick Hankoff.